In a previous video, I introduced this diagram. This diagram shows how river deltas change based on the different forces acting on the coastline. So, if there are high tides in the area, a delta will be tide-dominated and have wide channels. If a coastline has a lot of waves, it will have a pointed shape and also form strand plains or barrier islands. And finally, if a coastline is river-dominated, so there are no waves or tides acting upon it, it will form a bird foot shape and have many long channels. But there was something about this diagram that I didn't include, and that is the fact that there is so much more to coastlines than just river deltas. So let me now introduce the updated Classification of World Coastlines chart. This chart includes the river delta section, but this is only the top part of the triangle diagram. As you can see, there are many more sections which depend on the presence of wave, tide, and river energy. So in today's video, let's look at the features formed in the bottom half of this diagram, starting with tide-dominated estuaries. So tide-dominated estuaries form in places where a river is present, but this river is usually small or is not outputting that much sediment. Also, the tide energy is super strong. These strong tides prevent the river delta from expanding outwards or prograding the coastline. This makes these coastlines transgressive, which means that instead of the coast growing or prograding, it actually retreats because of these tides. These tide-dominated estuaries are also embayed, which means that sediments come from both the rivers and the ocean. This creates a more complicated mix of sediments than a typical river delta. So what are some primary features of tide-dominated estuaries? Well, the tides make it so that they have one primary channel which extends out into a funnel shape. But further inland, it may split into a few different sections and potentially form river islands. Also, further inland, where the river has deposited its sediments, there are often tidal flats or underwater delta channels. Because of the tides rising and lowering, the waters here are brackish, which means it is a mix of salt and fresh water. And this provides a very important habitat to many different species. So let's look at a few examples of tide-dominated estuaries. The best example of a tide-dominated estuary is Cobequid Bay in Canada. These tides in Nova Scotia, Canada are the strongest in the world, and this means that where rivers meet the sea, we can find these tide-dominated estuaries. So here in Cobequid Bay, you can see how the channel of the river greatly widens until it meets the sea, where it is limited by some existing geology. Looking further inland, you can see these tidal flats and underwater deltaic channels formed from the river sediment. And during lower tides, these islands get revealed to the surface. Another example of a tide-dominated estuary is the Dovey River in Wales. And this estuary also has wave action as well. This can be seen in the unique features it forms. So as you can see, we do have this one channel that widens as it meets the sea. Although this is much less extreme since the river is much smaller and the tides are a bit less. You can also see the tidal flats that would be underwater during high tide, but revealed during low tide. And finally, you can see how we have this sandbar, which is extending upwards into the channel. And this is an example of the wave action bringing sediment up along the coastline, which slightly closes the channel. And this example nicely leads us into wave-dominated estuaries. Wave-dominated estuaries are very similar to tide-dominated estuaries, but obviously they have wave energy instead of tide energy. They also have an embayed source of sediment, with sediment coming from both rivers and the ocean. And they are also transgressive, so the coastline is not growing. But unlike tide-dominated estuaries, the mouth of the river is very thin due to waves pushing sediment towards the mouth. Looking inwards from the mouth of the river, there will be a wider channel or lagoon from where the water slows down as it meets the sea. So essentially, the difference between wave and tide-dominated estuaries are where the river sediments end up. Tides push the sediments more inland, whereas the waves do not act on the sediment until it has reached the mouth. The Russian River in California is a great example of a wave-dominated estuary. As you can see, we have the river bringing sediment downstream, and it forms a wider channel, even with a river island, as it gets close to the ocean. But at the mouth, this river sediment has been pushed by the waves northwards, forming a sand spit, which greatly reduces the size of this mouth. In fact, for some periods of the year, this mouth completely closes off, essentially creating a lagoon. But eventually, the river will make its way above the sand, carving a new thin mouth. Willapa Bay in Washington is a good example of when there is a wave and tide mix, although it is a little stronger towards the wave energy. Looking inland, there are these wide tidal channels, and a lot of tidal flats formed where the river deposits its sediment. However, along the coastline, there is this very long sand spit, which has moved the mouth of the river northward and has limited its width. So to recap, if you see a river widening into one large channel once it meets a body of water, you can assume that it's an estuary. But to know whether it is wave-dominated, tide-dominated, or a mix of both, you can look at the different features formed by it. Now, you might notice something interesting about this chart, and that is that wave-dominated estuaries are more limited than tide-dominated estuaries. This is because if the river energy becomes too weak and the wave energy becomes too strong, it will form a coastal lagoon. A lagoon is a large bay that is cut off from the main body of water by a sand spit. Now this sand spit will always have one, but may have multiple openings to the main body of water. But these openings are very small. Coastal lagoons are still considered to be embayed because rivers do flow into these lagoons. But the vast majority of sediment comes from marine sources. But essentially, what makes lagoons distinct from estuaries is how limited their mouth is. And the reason that these lagoons form from wave energy instead of tide energy is because of longshore drift. Longshore drift is the process of sediment moving along a coastline due to angled waves. When the waves make contact with the coast at an angle, it will form swashes and backwashes. Swashes will push the sediment up at an angle, whereas backwashes will move them back down towards the body of water. And this process builds long sand spits. Usually these sand spits form along a natural point on a coastline, such as a bend in the coast. And this spit grows longer and longer until the lagoon is cut off. A great example is the Curonian Lagoon of Russia and Lithuania. There is the Nemunas River which flows into the lagoon, but the main action is the waves, which has formed a spit at this natural point along the coastline and has completely cut off this lagoon, apart from a very small channel at the northernmost point of the lagoon. So that has been the estuaries and lagoon portion of the chart. But now we must move to the very bottom of the chart, and these are places where there is essentially no rivers at all. This section will be more of your typical beaches, or what you'd expect of a typical coastline. But before we discuss this section, I have released a website, geobradmapping.com. And on this website, you can purchase many of the maps and charts I have made, including this coastline chart. In the future, I will also have a service to custom make maps as well. So if you are interested in purchasing this chart or one of my other maps, please consider checking it out. Let's start at the tide-dominated area with tidal flats. These tidal flats are found on coasts with hardly any waves and no rivers. They are characterized as mostly flat plains, where large areas get submerged at high tide and revealed at low tide. These tidal flats are prograding because the tides bring in more sediment to the shore, which extends the coastline outwards. Oftentimes, these tidal flats have tidal channels, where the water escapes out while the tide is lowering. Tidal flats are actually pretty easy to spot on satellite, you will usually see the main coastline and then this large area of sand which extends far out from the main coast. Another feature of tidal flats are the different zones of sediment. As you get closer to the shore, the grain sizes of the sediment shrinks. This is because finer sediments travel easier with the tides. This makes it so that closest to the coast during high tide there are mud flats, whereas further away there are usually sandy plains. However, this does all depend on the type of sediment getting into the area as well. One great example is near Cannes, Tunisia. Along this coast, there really aren't any rivers which flow into the Mediterranean Sea. But you can see how these tidal channels are created from where the water naturally drains during low tide. And there are also these muddy sediments which turn into more sandy sediments as you get further out from the coastline. The next section on our diagram is open coast tidal flats. Now these are very similar to regular tidal flats, except they are exposed to open water, which means they have more wave influence. Looking at tidal flats versus open coast tidal flats, there isn't much of a difference, but there are a few distinctions that are harder to see. One of these distinctions is the fact that open coast tidal flats are much smoother and flatter. This is because the waves run along the tidal flats and mostly flatten out the sediment. And this flattening also means that there are less tidal channels compared to the regular tidal flats. One great example is Mont Saint-Michel Bay in France, which has some of the strongest tides in all of Europe. The imagery isn't the best, but as you can see, there are these long tidal flats, which are very smooth and flat, lacking these tidal channels. Now let's move on to the wave-dominated section of these coastal plains. That is, wave-dominated beaches. Wave-dominated beaches are probably what you would expect of a classic beach. Waves bring sand or other sediments like gravel up the shore, slowly prograding the coastline. The waves form typical features of a beach. They will often be long and smooth due to longshore drift evening out the sediment, and they will almost always be thinner than tidal flats because the tides are not there to bring the sediment further out from the shoreline. Depending on the strength and angle of the waves, there are a few different features that could be formed. For example, depending on the placement of the breaker waves, or where the strong waves lose energy, a shallow terrace or a sandbar will form away from the beach. Good examples of wave-dominated beaches are any beach along a lake. This is because lakes do not have tides. Even the Great Lakes have no tides. So looking at any point along a lake, as long as it doesn't have a river flowing into that spot, there will be a wave-dominated beach. One example I went to just recently is the Great Sand Bay of the Keweenaw Peninsula. This beach has simply been formed due to the lake's waves bringing sand closer to the coastline. And interestingly, it even switches to rocks once you get further down the beach. And this is simply because of the available sediments, I presume. Finally, one last feature you can see is this very long sandbar, which is formed at the location of the breaker waves. Moving on to a section with a little bit more tides, there are tide-dominated beaches, also known as tidally modulated shore faces. Tide-dominated beaches are very similar to wave-dominated beaches, but obviously they have more tidal action. More of the beach is revealed in low tide, and there are some unique features, such as ridge and runnels. Ridge and runnels are small variations in the elevation of a beach, where more sand has been deposited on the ridge than the runnel. And this causes water to get trapped within the runnel, forming essentially small pools of water. A great example are the beaches of Normandy, such as Omaha Beach, which has these ridge and runnel features that you can see just by looking at satellite view. And also, you can see on Street View how this is a very flat beach which gets revealed during low tide. In fact, Omaha Beach is very close to being an open coast tidal flat, but it still remains in the tide-dominated beach section. Now that has been every section, but there is one more thing about this diagram you have probably noticed. There are two labels that seem to go in between these four sections at the bottom, that being Strand plains and chenier plains. The reason that Strand plains and chenier plains are not in their own sections and are instead between the beaches and tidal flats is because not every coastline forms them. In fact, there are pretty specific parameters that have to happen for them to form. Number one is a specific sediment supply. These usually come from rivers further down the coast. It is important to note that this does not make them river-dominated, since the sediment makes its way into the ocean first. It just originates from the rivers. Also, there needs to be longshore currents. The waves move at an angle along the coast, which brings sediments parallel, and the sediments gets deposited along the beach. And this forms the typical look of a strand and chenier plain, of parallel beach ridges and flatlands, creating a coastline that looks like strands. But what is the difference between these strand plains and chenier plains? Well, let's start with strand plains. In a strand plain, the coastline needs to have cyclical periods of wave strength. This could be consistent storms or just periods of strong winds. The reason for this is because waves need to break at the shoreline, deposit their sediment, and then wash over that sediment. And this grows up a beach ridge. After this period of strong waves forming a ridge, a flatland will form until the next period of strong waves where another ridge will be deposited. And importantly, in a strand plain, the sediment is sandy, so both the beach ridges and the flatlands are composed of sand. A great example is the Nyrich strand plain, a feature which I discussed in a previous video, but as you can see, there are hundreds of these parallel dunes and flatlands. Next we have chenier plains. Chenier plains are even less common since they need a mix of both muddy and sandy sediments. In a chenier plain, while some waves are still necessary to bring the sediment close to the shore, and the sediments need to be sorted in a process called winnowing, the tides allow for the overwash needed for the beach ridge growth. The ridges of chenier plains consist of sandy sediments due to the winnowing process, but in between these ridges are mud flats. And chenier plains are often flatter than strand plains because of the muddy sediment. The mud prevents higher ridges from being created. A good example of a chenier plain is the coast of Suriname, specifically near Galibi. Muddy sediments from the Amazon and sandy sediments from other rivers have grown these ridges and flatlands. So that is the updated classification of coastlines chart. Hopefully now you can look at any coastline and determine where it would be on this chart, whether it has strong river forces forming a delta, strong wave forces forming a beach, or strong tidal forces forming tidal flats, or anywhere in between. However, this chart doesn't explain every coastline. Take fjords, for example, where there are mountains right next to the sea. In this case, even though the coast technically is wave, river, or tide dominated, you will not find the features such as a river-dominated delta or a beach because of the extreme topography. These coasts that do not form these features on the chart are known as immature because the sediment hasn't been able to fill in the waterway. And fjords are the most common example of an immature coastline. But I encourage you to look at any coastline and determine where it may fall on this chart. But that's going to be all for today's video. If you would like a copy of this chart, please check out my website. But I will see you guys in the next video.